Claire never expected silence to have a shape, but it did. It took form in the empty spaces Daniel used to fill, the absence of his laugh in the morning, the click of his boots across the hallway, the way he'd hum tunelessly while making coffee. It was all gone, and in its place a silence that was heavy and alive. And within that silence moved a shadow. Samson. He followed her everywhere. From the moment Daniel's casket was lowered into the earth, Samson had locked onto Claire like a second skin. She didn't want it, didn't want him. He was supposed to be Daniel's dog, his service companion, his soldier, not hers. Not now. And yet he was there, everywhere. The black Labrador had once been Daniel's pride, a loyal, alert, highly trained service dog for his PTSD and late-onset seizures. He'd been calm, methodical, obedient. More than a pet, he was Daniel's guardian. Claire never bonded with him, not because she disliked dogs, but because she understood, deep down, that Samson wasn't hers. He was Daniel's shadow, always had been. He walked at Daniel's heel, slept at the foot of Daniel's bed, responded only to Daniel's voice commands. Claire was polite to him, even gentle, but distant, detached. He wasn't hers to love, but now Daniel was gone, and Samson, impossibly, had attached himself to her. He followed her like he used to follow Daniel, never barking, never whining, just there, watching, breathing, waiting. She couldn't escape his eyes, those deep brown eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Every time she sat down, he sat near. If she went upstairs, he trailed behind. If she cried in the kitchen, he watched from the doorway, unmoving, like he was guarding something far more fragile than he'd ever protected before. It unsettled her. At first she thought maybe he was just confused. Dogs grieve, right? Maybe he was waiting for Daniel to walk through the door. Maybe he was broken. "I'm not your person," she said once, while doing dishes with him lying silently at her feet. "You're wasting your time." He didn't flinch, didn't shift, just stayed. That night, Claire stood at the bedroom door and hesitated. It had been weeks since Daniel died, and she still hadn't moved his things. His dresser remained untouched. His boots sat by the closet like he might need them any minute. His pillow still carried the scent of his aftershave. She wasn't ready to let it go. Samson sat by the door, his eyes trained on her like a sentry. She shut the door on both of them. Inside, she cried into Daniel's pillow until sleep finally took her. The next morning, she found Samson curled against the door, like he'd been there all night. "You're not doing this," she muttered, stepping over him. "You don't get to become mine just because he's gone." But he followed her anyway. The routine never changed. Wake, follow, watch, sleep, repeat. He never barked, never begged for food. He simply hovered, silent and steady. Her son called once a week, always the same conversation. "Are you sure you want to keep him, Mom?" "No." "Well, have you thought about finding him a new home?" "Yes." But that's all she ever said. She didn't have the energy to explain how complicated it felt. How Samson's presence made everything worse, and yet, more bearable, like a ghost that haunted her, but also kept her company. She began looking at shelters, not the bad ones, the no-kill ones with bright play yards and volunteer walkers. She even called a woman named Leslie, who ran a service animal foster program. "He's not just a pet," Claire said on the phone. "He was trained for my husband. He needs someone who actually needs him." Leslie had a kind voice. "He might still be doing his job, you know." Claire laughed, bitterly. His job's gone. But Leslie didn't push. She just gave her a list of names and wished her peace. The next week, Claire scheduled a meet and greet with a veteran in recovery who'd been looking for a trained companion. She cleaned the house, brushed Samson, put his leash on, and waited by the door. When the man arrived, Samson stood between them and growled. Low, steady, dangerous. It was the first sound he'd made since Daniel died. Claire was mortified. "I don't know what's gotten into him." The man, surprisingly understanding, backed off. Maybe he's not ready to move on either. Later that week, it happened again, with a family looking for a therapy dog for their autistic son. Samson refused to enter the living room. When they tried to pet him, he backed into the hallway and lay down, his head on his paws, refusing to budge. Again and again, he resisted. Claire tried to rationalize it. Maybe he's just anxious. Maybe he's too old to adjust. But a deeper voice inside her whispered something else. He doesn't want to leave. And somewhere inside, neither do you. One morning, she sat at the kitchen table with a half-eaten piece of toast in front of her. Her coffee had gone cold. The rain tapped at the windows in a rhythm she used to find comforting. But now it just reminded her of all the mornings she'd spent sitting across from Daniel, reading the paper, arguing about the crossword. Samson sat at her feet, unmoving. She finally looked at him. Really looked. His eyes didn't plead. They didn't beg. They simply knew. And that terrified her. "You're not broken," she whispered. "You're waiting for me to admit I am." That night, as she brushed her teeth and avoided the mirror, she heard him again, moving, pacing. The soft click-click-click of claws on hardwood, just outside her bedroom. He did this every night now. Always just outside the door. Always when she turned off the lights. She opened the door. He stood. "What do you want from me?" she snapped. He tilted his head, then walked in, slow and steady, and stood by the bed. Claire sighed. "No, not tonight." She tried to push him out. He didn't budge. Finally, frustrated and drained, she left the door open and climbed into bed. Moments later, she felt the weight of him jump up onto the mattress. She sat bolt upright. Samson, no. But he didn't move to the foot of the bed. He didn't curl beside her like a normal dog might. He crawled forward and laid his head directly across her chest, right beneath her collarbone, pressing into her skin with a quiet desperation. Her hands froze in midair. He didn't lick. He didn't growl. He didn't move. He just lay there, breathing, waiting. And something beneath her skin tightened, an ache she hadn't noticed before. She pushed him off, harder than she meant to. "Get off me." He stumbled off the bed and sat down on the floor, looking up at her. Not hurt, not angry, just watching. Claire sat there for a long time, heart pounding. She touched the spot where his head had rested. The ache was still there, small, sharp, maybe nothing, but maybe not. And somehow, for the first time in weeks, she couldn't sleep, because the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like a warning. If you're still here listening, stay with us. Claire's story is only just beginning, and what this dog does next will leave you breathless. Like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss a moment of what's to come. This isn't just a story about loss, it's a story about what love leaves behind, and how it finds its way back to us when we least expect it. Claire hadn't cried when she buried Daniel. Not during the service. Not at the cemetery. Not even when the folded flag was placed in her lap with whispered thanks from men in uniform. She'd sat still, silent, staring at the empty sky, trying to understand how the man who once filled every corner of her world could now fit inside a wooden box. But she cried the morning after Samson jumped into her bed. She hadn't meant to. The tears didn't come with a grand thought or a memory. They came with the sound of his nails on the floorboards, soft, slow, deliberate, as he followed her down the stairs yet again. She sat at the kitchen table, untouched toast in front of her, and looked down at him lying on the rug, head resting between his paws, his eyes tracking her every breath. "I can't do this," she whispered. He didn't move. "I can't be what you need. I don't want you here. You weren't meant for me. You were his. You still are." She said it like a final truth, like a line being drawn in the sand, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like guilt. She grabbed her phone and called her son. "I'm doing it," she said. He didn't ask what. He knew. "I think that's a good decision, Mom," he said gently. "It's not fair to keep a dog you can't connect with, especially one who's trained to work. Maybe he can help someone else now." She nodded, even though he couldn't see it. Yeah. That afternoon, she called Leslie again, the woman from the Veterans Dog Placement Program. This time her voice didn't shake. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's find Samson a new home." Leslie was kind, respectful. "Okay, I have someone in mind, retired medic, recently diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. He's been waiting for a placement. I can arrange a visit this weekend." Claire glanced over at Samson, lying in the same spot by the door where he always camped out. His eyes flicked toward her. No expression. No movement. Yeah, that's fine. She hung up the phone and sat back in the silence. For the first time, the silence felt like betrayal. The next day, she tried preparing herself. She washed Samson's bed, brushed his coat, laid out his leash and vest. She even dug through Daniel's old things and found the training certificate. Samson certified PTSD plus medical response service dog. It still smelled like Daniel's desk. When she laid it out on the table, she hesitated. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, then curled into a fist. He was proud of you, you know, she murmured without looking up. Called you his guardian angel. Samson didn't move, but she saw the shift. His ears perked, his body tensing ever so slightly. He needed you, she added. I didn't. I still don't. That night she couldn't sleep. Again. But it wasn't grief keeping her awake this time. It was something else. Restlessness. Like the moment before a storm when the air is too still, too quiet. And then scratching. At her door. Soft at first. Then more insistent. Claire sat up in bed, her chest tightening. Not again, she thought. She opened the door. Samson was standing there, eyes fixed on her like he'd been waiting all night. She tried to close it again, but he placed one heavy paw over the threshold. I said no. He didn't move. I'm not yours. But her voice cracked, because the truth was, he wasn't hers. Not really. And she wasn't his. Not in the way Daniel had been. But there was something between them now. Something forged not by choice but by pain. Shared quiet, persistent pain. She opened the door fully. He walked in and lay on the floor beside her bed. She didn't stop him. She didn't sleep, either. Morning came like a sigh. Slow and gray. A gentle drizzle misted the windows, blurring the trees beyond them. Claire dressed in silence, tying her sweater tighter than usual, like she could hold herself together with wool and buttons. At 10 a.m., the doorbell rang. Samson didn't bark. He stood. Claire opened the door to find Leslie and the man she'd mentioned, a tall, kind-faced veteran named Rick. He had a tremor in his left hand, barely noticeable, and eyes that darted from Samson to Claire and back again. Thanks for letting us come by, he said. He looks like a good boy. Claire forced a smile. He is. Leslie explained that the meeting would be short, just a chance for Rick and Samson to get to know each other in a neutral setting. If things went well, they'd schedule a trial transfer. Claire nodded, stepped aside. Samson didn't move. Leslie clicked her tongue. Come on, Samson. Nothing. Rick stepped forward, crouching low, offering his hand. Samson growled. Low. Steady. Claire's heart skipped. Samson, no. Leslie raised her hands calmly. It's okay. He's just nervous. But Samson wasn't nervous. His body was braced, not frightened but resistant. His eyes locked on Claire. Not Rick, not Leslie. Her. Like he was waiting for her to say something, or stop something, or understand something. Claire stepped forward. Let me talk to him. She knelt beside him, resting her hand on his back. His fur was warm beneath her fingers. You have to go, she whispered. He pressed closer to her. You were not mine. You were never mine. He let out a soft, barely audible whine, and in that sound something inside her cracked. She didn't cry. Not yet. But she looked up at Leslie, her voice tight. I'm sorry. I thought I was ready. I'm not.
Yeah.
Leslie nodded.
We understand.
Rick gave a small smile. You're not the first one to change their mind, especially with a dog like this. They left quietly. The door shut behind them. Claire collapsed into the armchair and buried her face in her hands. I don't get it, she whispered. Why are you doing this? Samson walked over and sat at her feet, eyes watching her with that same calm, knowing expression. She looked at him, really looked, and suddenly she didn't see Daniel's dog anymore. She saw her companion, her shadow, her warning bell. That night, something shifted. She didn't push him out of the bedroom. She left the door open, and when he jumped onto the bed and laid his head across her chest again, right below the collarbone, she didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She let him stay.
Yeah.
Because part of her was beginning to believe he knew something she didn't. And this time, she was willing to listen. Dear listener, if this moment hit something in you, if you've ever tried to let go of something that turned out to be the thing saving you, please like this video. It helps more people find these stories. Leave us a comment if you've ever had a pet refuse to give up on you. And subscribe because Claire and Samson's story is only getting deeper, and what happens next may just change her life forever. Claire never used to believe in signs. She believed in the things she could touch, fold, clean, keep tidy. Grocery lists, laundry loads, Daniel's medications lined up in that blue pill organizer she used to refill every Sunday morning without fail. Order was comforting, predictable, even when life wasn't. But now, in the middle of the night, lying wide awake with a dog she tried to rehome sleeping on her floor, Claire found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. It started subtly at first. Every night, when the house fell quiet and her body slowed, Samson would rise. He wouldn't bark, wouldn't whimper. He would simply stand outside her door and pace, back and forth, his nails tapping on the wood like a metronome to her restlessness. The first few times, she tried to ignore it. Maybe he misses Daniel's routine, she muttered. Maybe he's just unsettled. But it kept happening. Every night, when she turned off the lamp, she'd hear him shift. When she rolled onto her side, he'd scratch once at the door. When she lay on her back, he'd whine. It wasn't random. It was timed, specific, measured, like he was trying to tell her something. Then came the night it escalated. It was around 3 a.m. The house was silent, save for the wind brushing tree limbs against the siding. Claire lay in bed, half asleep, half aware of the familiar pressure building behind her ribs, the dull kind of weight that no longer surprised her. Her grief had settled there, like sediment. Suddenly the door burst open. She gasped, sitting upright. Samson, the Labrador, had never forced his way in before, but this time he wasn't waiting outside. He charged straight to the bed, leapt up with a heavy thump, and planted himself squarely across her chest. His weight pressed into her sternum, and for a split second, panic flared in her chest. Sam, get off. She tried to shove him away, but he didn't budge. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't afraid. He was focused. His head was buried just below her collarbone. His body stretched across her like a living shield. His breath was shallow, his eyes wide. He was shaking, and he wasn't looking at her. He was looking into her. Samson, stop. She pushed harder, and finally managed to slide out from under him. He scrambled to follow, nudging at her chest, licking the same spot again and again. She stood up, panting. What is wrong with you? But even in her frustration, something was wrong with her. She could feel it. That dull weight in her chest had grown sharper, denser. She clutched the area under her collarbone, right where he'd been pressing. It wasn't sore, not exactly, but it wasn't right either. She slept on the couch that night, or tried to. Samson laid by her side the entire time, unmoving. Every time she shifted, he looked up. His eyes never left her. In the morning she climbed the stairs and paused halfway to catch her breath. Her chest ached again. It wasn't the kind of ache grief left behind. It was something else. Something tighter. It's just stress, she muttered. Just age. Maybe the stairs. But even as she said it, her hand found its way back to the spot beneath her collarbone. By mid-afternoon, Samson had started barking. Claire was in the living room, seated in her recliner with the curtains drawn, a book open on her lap she wasn't really reading. Samson sat across the room at first, then rose and barked. Once, loud, sharp. Claire jolted. Hey. No. He barked again, eyes locked on her. Then he moved toward her, slow, deliberate, until he stood directly in front of her. He stared at her chest, then circled her chair once, twice, a third time. Then he stopped, sat, stared. What are you doing? She whispered. He didn't blink. Her hand rose again. That same spot, that same faint, strange sensation. This time, it radiated slightly, almost like pressure. The book slipped from her lap and hit the floor. She stared down at him. You're not just following me, are you? His ears twitched. You're watching me. She stood up. Samson followed. She paced the room. He matched her step for step, always on her left, always staring upward, just beneath her shoulder. She grabbed her coat and opened the front door, needing air, needing distance. Samson didn't follow. He stood in the doorway and whined. "Fine," she muttered. "Suit yourself." She sat on the porch steps, arms crossed against the April chill. Her neighbor Melissa walked by moments later, arms full of groceries. "Morning, Claire," she called with a warm smile. "How are you holding up?" Claire shrugged. "I don't know anymore." Melissa stopped and walked over, her tone softer. "He's still sticking close, huh?" Claire nodded toward the door. "He's glued to me, won't stop pacing, or barking, or watching." Melissa glanced over. "He's grieving too, you know. They say dogs can mourn. Sometimes they don't even know how to process it. They act strange, like they're looking for someone who isn't coming home." Claire nodded slowly. "I used to think that, but now I'm starting to wonder if he's not looking for Daniel. Maybe he's trying to protect me from something else." Melissa tilted her head. "What makes you say that?" Claire paused. "He keeps pressing his head right here." She tapped her chest. "He barks every time I sit down, circles me like he's tracking a scent. And lately, I've been having these chest pains." Melissa's face sobered. "You should see a doctor, Claire. It's probably nothing." "Still," Melissa said, her tone kind but firm. "What if it's not?" Claire said nothing. Melissa reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes animals know before we do, especially ones trained to care." That night, Claire pulled out Daniel's old notebooks from the bottom drawer of his desk. He used to jot things down, training notes, reminders, scribbled thoughts. It had been months since she opened them. Dust clung to the leather cover. She flipped through pages, looking for something, anything, and then she found it. A note in Daniel's handwriting. "Samson sensed my panic before I did, alerted me twice, just stared at me until I lay down. Breathing calmed after. He knows. He always knows." Claire's breath hitched. She read it again, and again. Samson had done this before. Not barking, not pulling, just watching, warning. She looked up. He was lying across the room, eyes trained on her. She whispered, "You're not broken, are you?" He blinked. "You're still doing your job." She set the notebook down and walked over to him. He rose immediately, tail wagging faintly. "I'm sorry," she said softly, resting her hand on his head. "I thought you were just lost without Daniel." He leaned into her. "But maybe you were never following me out of grief." She knelt beside him, her face level with his. "Maybe you were following me out of love." Dear listener, if you've made it this far, if you've ever felt like someone, or something, was trying to protect you in a way you couldn't understand, please like this video. These are the moments that remind us how deep love runs, even when we try to shut it out. Drop a comment if a pet ever sensed something before you did, and subscribe, because Claire is about to discover the truth behind Samson's instincts, and it's a truth that could save her life. The days felt longer now, not because of time, but because of tension. Something had shifted in Claire, and she couldn't deny it anymore. Not the tightness in her chest, not the way her breathing slowed when she reached the top of the stairs, not the pressure, subtle but present, beneath her collarbone, and not Samson's eyes, which seemed to grow more intense by the hour. She could feel his stare when she washed dishes, when she folded laundry, when she sat on the porch with her lukewarm coffee growing cold in her hands. He never looked away, always watching her, always waiting, as if some unseen countdown had started, and only he could hear the ticking. She hadn't told anyone. Not yet. What would she even say? "My dead husband's dog keeps watching my chest, and now I can't breathe as easily." No one would understand. Except Samson. He understood everything. That morning Claire reached for a baking sheet on the top shelf in the pantry, something she used to do without thinking. But as she stretched upward, a sharp, needle-like pain bloomed beneath her left breast. It wasn't enough to double her over, but it was enough. She froze, lowered her arm, touched the spot. The pain subsided, but it didn't leave. She turned slowly and caught Samson staring from the doorway, tail completely still. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she whispered. He walked over and nudged her leg once, then sat. Fine, she sighed. I'll rest, just for today. But rest wasn't what she got. Later that afternoon she sank into the recliner, a spot that used to be Daniel's, back when his back couldn't handle the couch anymore. The chair had always felt like him. Big, sturdy, safe. But now it felt like something else. A test. Samson stood in front of the recliner the moment she eased into it. He barked once, loud and insistent. She flinched. What now? He barked again. She waved a hand. Stop it. I'm sitting. You said to rest, remember? But he wouldn't stop. Bark, bark, bark. The sound echoed off the living room walls like an alarm. Samson. Then he stopped. He circled the recliner once, twice, 3 times. Then he stood still, staring at her chest like there was something beneath her skin he could see, and she couldn't. She touched the area again. It wasn't sharp now, just heavy. He let out a low guttural sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a whine. Something in between, a sound that held urgency. Okay, she whispered. What is it? What are you trying to tell me? He stepped forward and pressed his head gently against her collarbone. Again, the same spot. The exact same spot as before. This time she didn't push him away. She sat still, letting him lean against her. The silence between them felt louder than ever. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. She closed her eyes, and for the first time she didn't fight the thought. Something was wrong. She climbed the stairs slowly that night, hand on the banister, legs heavier than usual. Her breath caught in her throat halfway up. She paused, bent slightly, waited until it eased. Behind her, Samson stood motionless, watching her every move. Don't look at me like that, she said between breaths. It's probably stress, maybe I pulled something. But her voice lacked conviction. In bed she didn't sleep. She couldn't. She kept waiting for a sign, a clue, some confirmation that all this was in her head. That maybe Samson had gone too long without Daniel. That maybe she was just letting her grief shape ghosts in her own body. But around 2:30 a.m., it happened again. The door creaked open. Samson entered. He didn't leap onto the bed this time. He stood at her bedside, waiting. Claire rolled onto her side. He scratched the floor. She shifted to her back. He whimpered. She looked at him. You're really not going to let me ignore this, are you? He pressed his nose into her ribs, then stepped back and stared at her. Unblinking, unmoving. And for the first time Claire reached for her phone and typed something she'd been avoiding for days. Pain under collarbone. Shortness of breath. Fatigue. The search results came quickly. She scrolled. Her eyes caught words that made her stomach twist. Breast cancer. Warning signs. Don't ignore persistent pain. Caught early equals sign. Treatable. She locked the phone. Sat up. Okay, she whispered. She looked at Samson. Okay, he didn't move. He didn't need to. He'd already said everything without a word. The next morning she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her tea as if it could answer the question she didn't want to ask out loud. And then she saw it. A breast cancer awareness ad on the television, playing low in the background. A woman speaking softly about early detection, warning signs. Trust your instincts. Get checked even if you think it's nothing. Claire stared, then slowly turned to look at Samson. He was standing directly in front of the screen, his body between her and the commercial. His eyes found hers, and he barked. Once. Claire. Direct. Echoing through the room like a thunderclap. Claire's heart stopped. Then she stood. She picked up her phone and called the clinic. Hi, she said, her voice shaking. I need to schedule a mammogram. Soon as possible. The receptionist offered a date 2 weeks out. No, Claire said. That's too long. My dog thinks something's wrong. There was a pause on the other end. I'll call you if we have a cancellation. Please, Claire whispered. Call me. She hung up. Tears stung her eyes. Samson walked over and placed his head in her lap, and for the first time she let herself cry. Not from grief, not from missing Daniel, but from the fear that something had been happening inside her for weeks, maybe months, and she hadn't seen it. But Samson had. He always had. 2 days later the clinic called. They had an opening. Tomorrow morning, 8:30 a.m., she whispered. Thank you, hung up, and looked at Samson. He wagged his tail, just once. That night she left the door open. When Samson climbed onto the bed, she didn't say a word. He curled beside her, his body pressed gently into hers. And Claire, for the first time in what felt like forever, slept deeply. Because she knew now, this wasn't just Daniel's dog. This was something else entirely. A guardian. A warning. A gift she never asked for, but one she now couldn't live without. Dear listener, if you've ever had a moment where your pet seemed to know something you didn't, if you've ever been saved by love you didn't understand at the time, please like this video. These stories matter, and your voice helps others find them. Comment below with your own stories of animal intuition, and don't forget to subscribe. Claire's journey is about to reach a moment of truth, and what the doctors find next might just change everything. The clinic was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that settled in your bones and made your skin itch. Claire sat in the corner of the waiting room, arms wrapped around herself, one thumb rubbing the skin over her collarbone, where Samson had pressed his head again and again. She kept glancing at the clock, even though the minutes barely moved. Her name was called, her coat slipped off, and she followed the nurse with wooden steps into a cold, sterile room where she stood alone beneath fluorescent lights. The technician's hands were kind, her voice soft, but nothing could calm the churn inside Claire's chest. What am I doing here? She knew the answer, because he told you to be. She went through the scan, the compression, the angles, the awkward silences that stretched too long between movements. When it was over, she dressed slowly. Her fingers trembled on the buttons of her shirt, and as she waited for results, sitting in a bland room with outdated magazines and a too-soft couch, her mind drifted not forward but back. To Daniel, to a memory she hadn't touched in years. It came like a wave, sudden and vivid. Claire sat on the back porch with a glass of lemonade, the sky dusky and lavender, the sound of crickets buzzing beneath the lazy hum of a distant lawnmower. She was flipping through a gardening catalog, debating whether to order rose bulbs, when Daniel walked out, moving stiffly, a hand pressed to his chest. "Danny," she said, sitting upright. "What is it?" I think I need to lie down." Samson was already at his side. The Labrador had been asleep by the screen door moments before, but was now pressed against Daniel, nudging him gently, herding him backward like he knew exactly what to do. Claire panicked. "Should I call someone?" Daniel shook his head. No, it's passing, just a wave of pressure." Samson's body stiffened. He let out a sharp bark. That was the first time Daniel mentioned it. He sensed it before I did. Claire hadn't taken it seriously then. Neither had Daniel. He'd brushed it off as a lucky guess, a coincidence. But it kept happening. The night terrors, the sudden migraines, the dizzy spells. Samson always knew first. She remembered one time in particular. Daniel had just sat down at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, smiling as she told him about Melissa's ridiculous squirrel-proof bird feeder. Out of nowhere, Samson barked and bolted to his side, nudging him repeatedly with growing intensity. 30 seconds later, Daniel's hand began to tremble. His lips turned pale. He collapsed. That seizure had changed everything. It was when Daniel finally agreed to take his medical condition seriously. When he wrote the note in his training log, "Samson knows, trust the dog." Claire blinked. Her present-day surroundings came back into focus. Too fast, too loud. The hum of the vending machine. The distant buzz of someone laughing at a TV no one was watching. She stood up, knees stiff, and walked over to the window. The parking lot below looked blurry through the smudged glass, and in the passenger seat of her car, she could just make out the shape of Samson's head. He was waiting for her. Not anxiously, patiently, like he already knew what they were about to hear. The door opened behind her. A nurse stepped in, face unreadable. "The doctor will see you now." Claire nodded. Her body was moving, but her thoughts were swimming in cold water. Every step to the consultation room felt like walking into fog. The doctor was gentle, measured, professional. She used all the right words. Early detection, aggressive but small, treatable, options. Claire only heard one thing: cancer. It was there, hiding beneath her skin, quiet, steady, growing, and Samson had known. Before the fatigue, before the pain, before the breathlessness. He had known. Claire didn't cry. Not in front of the doctor. Not as she booked her next appointments. Not as she was handed pamphlets and phone numbers and treatment plan outlines. She waited until she was back in the car. Back beside Samson. He was sitting upright in the passenger seat, eyes locked on her before she even shut the door. She gripped the steering wheel, keys still dangling from the ignition, and let out one broken breath, then another, and then she fell apart. Tears poured down her cheeks, dripping onto her hands, her chest, her lap. Her sobs were not loud, but they were deep. Years of grief, fear, guilt, and exhaustion poured out in waves. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't listen. I didn't believe you." Samson shifted, placing his head gently on her knee. His tail didn't wag. He didn't move again. He just stayed there, his breath steady, his warmth anchoring her to the moment. Claire reached down, hand sliding across his smooth black fur. "You saved me," she whispered. "You saved me, and I pushed you away." They sat like that for a long time. The sun dipped behind the clouds. The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of her coat. When she finally turned the key and drove home, Samson leaned into her arm the entire ride. That night, she didn't close her bedroom door. Samson climbed up onto the bed, curled into her side, and she let him stay, because this wasn't just her healing journey anymore. It was theirs. In the days that followed, Claire moved differently, not because she felt stronger, because she was learning to be weak, learning to admit she was scared, learning to accept help, especially from the one who had been trying to give it all along. She scheduled the biopsy, consulted with the surgeon, told her son over the phone, in a voice that shook but didn't crack. She even told Melissa, who came over that afternoon with soup, tissues, and a strength that Claire had never realized she needed. "Whatever happens," Melissa said, resting her hand over Claire's, "you're not going through it alone. You have us." Claire looked down at Samson, curled at her feet. "No," she said softly, "I never was." Later that evening, Claire walked into Daniel's office. The smell was still there. Books, paper, the faint scent of leather from the chair he used to sit in. She pulled out the box of his journals again, and added her own note, folded it once, slipped it between the pages. "You were right, he always knows. And now, he's mine too." Dear listener, if you've ever been held together by something, or someone, who saw your pain before you did, please like this video. These moments remind us that love has layers, that healing often begins with the most unexpected companions. Share your story in the comments, if an animal has ever noticed something you didn't. And be sure to subscribe, because Claire's journey is only beginning, and what comes next is the proof that miracles can have paws. The quiet moments in Claire's house had changed. They were no longer the haunted silences of grief or the aching stillness of loneliness. Now they felt more like pauses between chapters, breaths held between heartbreak and healing. But beneath that fragile peace there was urgency, a kind of silent countdown Claire could feel in the marrow of her bones. Her surgery was scheduled. The biopsy had confirmed it. An aggressive tumor, small but fast, but it hadn't spread. They had caught it early. The doctor said she was lucky. Claire didn't feel lucky. She felt like she had been standing at the edge of something dark, and had been pulled back by a leash, by Samson. He followed her even closer now, if that was possible, always by her side, always alert. His tail barely wagged, his face always serious, and every night he curled against her chest, pressing gently, almost protectively, like a shield of fur and bone between her and the unknown. It was late, one of those long, impossible nights before the operation, when sleep felt like a stranger and even breathing took effort. Claire lay awake, her thoughts spiraling through memories of Daniel, the what-ifs, the what-knows. Every hour passed like a whisper across her bedroom walls. And then again Samson moved. He stood from his place beside the bed, climbed up, and this time he didn't pause at her feet, or wait for permission. He came straight to her. He stepped carefully, deliberately, until he was stretched along her left side. Then he pressed his nose into the same spot, just under her breast, like he had every night before. But this time he didn't stop at a nudge. He began to whine, low and long. Then he licked, not frantically, gently, slowly, again and again, right where the tumor was. Claire gasped. Her hand shot down instinctively, and for the first time she felt it clearly. A mass, hard, firm, fixed. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't felt it like this before, or maybe she had, and ignored it. But Samson hadn't ignored it. He had never ignored it. Tears welled in her eyes, and her voice cracked when she whispered, "Is that what you've been trying to tell me?" He looked up at her, eyes wide, ears pulled back. There was no fear in him, just fierce, unwavering concern. "I'm sorry," she breathed. "I'm so sorry." He rested his head in the crook of her arm. That morning she didn't need her alarm. She rose early, made coffee, sat with her back straight and her hands steady. She had her surgery bag packed, her paperwork in order. The house was quiet, sunlight just beginning to touch the windows. Samson stood at the door before she even grabbed her keys. "I wish I could take you," she said. He tilted his head. I know. You'd sit by me through the whole thing, wouldn't you?" He sat waiting. Claire knelt beside him and rested her forehead against his. "I'm going to be okay," she whispered, trying to believe it herself. "Thanks to you." She left the radio on for him, left his bed fluffed, left a note for Melissa, asking her to check in. Then she drove herself to the hospital. Alone, but not really, because the truth was, she could still feel him with her. His warning, his love, his persistence. Every time the nurse asked how she caught it so early, she said the same thing. "My husband's service dog wouldn't stop watching me." They smiled, not understanding, but it didn't matter. The operation went well, clean margins, no complications. When she woke groggy and disoriented, the first thing she asked for wasn't water. It was Samson. Melissa brought him home 2 days later. She barely made it through the door before he was at her feet, tail wagging gently, nose pressed against her side. Not frantically, not desperately. This time his posture said something different. He knew it was gone. Claire knelt on the floor, wrapping her arms around his neck, weeping into his fur. "Thank you," she whispered. You saved me. You saved me." Recovery was slow, painful, but bearable, because she wasn't doing it alone. Samson became more than her companion. He became her mirror. When she struggled to get out of bed, he nudged her gently, then waited at the door until she stood. When she cried in the shower, he waited on the bath mat, chin resting on his paws. When she winced brushing her hair, he stared until she set the brush down and let herself rest. And one night, something shifted. Claire sat at the edge of her bed, pale and tired, but finally healing, and said aloud, "I can't keep calling you Samson." The name felt like a memory, a remnant of a man who no longer walked these halls. "You're not his shadow anymore." She looked at him, her guardian, her miracle, her friend. "You're Sam now." His ears twitched. She smiled through her exhaustion. "That okay with you?" He barked once, soft, certain. From that moment on he was Sam, not Daniel's dog, her dog. He stayed by her through every radiation session, waiting in the car with Melissa, or resting by the door until she returned. He slept on the couch while she dozed under weighted blankets. He kept vigil through pain and fear, and nights she didn't want to face alone. He never left, and she never wanted him to. One afternoon, Claire stood at the bathroom mirror, tying a scarf over her head, her hair mostly gone, her skin paler than she'd ever seen it. She stared at herself, unrecognizable, stronger, scarred. Sam sat behind her, reflected in the glass. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since Daniel's funeral, she smiled without faking it. "You knew before I did," she said. "You knew I was worth saving." He walked over and leaned against her leg. Later, she brought down a framed photo of Daniel from the mantel. She placed it beside a new photo, one of Sam with his head in her lap. Then she added something new, a framed ink paw print, stamped in dark gray on white paper. 3 frames, 3 parts of the same love. That evening she made tea, curled into Daniel's old recliner, and watched Sam sleep on the rug. "Do you know what you are?" she said quietly. His tail thumped once. "You're his last gift to me." And this time it didn't feel like grief. It felt like grace. Dear listener, if you've ever looked into the eyes of an animal and felt like they saw the real you, the pain, the fear, the parts no one else could touch, please like this video. These stories remind us that healing sometimes comes with fur and 4 legs. Leave a comment if a pet has walked with you through something heavy, and subscribe to stay with us, because Claire's story isn't over yet. What she does next will complete the circle and show us how love, when given room, always finds a way to live on. There's a kind of silence that follows a diagnosis, not the shock, not the fear, but the moment when everything slows. When the world shrinks to the pulse in your ears and the soft tick of a clock on a sterile wall. Claire sat in the oncology wing, shoulders slumped, scarf tight around her head, waiting on the final word. She already knew what it would be, because Sam had told her, not with words, not even with noise, but with that stare, that pressure, the way he paced, the way he wouldn't let her rest, the way he'd pressed his head against her chest like he was trying to push something out. That relentless, protective love, desperate and gentle all at once. It had led her here. The doctor finally entered, clipboard in hand. His face was calm, too calm. Claire braced herself. "You were right to come in when you did," he began. "The surgery removed the tumor successfully, clean margins, but the pathology revealed signs that it was highly aggressive. We'll need to move forward with treatment. Radiation first, possibly chemo." Claire nodded slowly. No tears, no outbursts, just a quiet strength growing where fear used to live. The doctor looked at her over the rim of his glasses. Most people wouldn't have caught this so early. She smiled faintly. "I had help." She didn't explain, didn't need to. Sam was waiting in the car, like always. Melissa had driven her that day, her voice a steady presence in the waiting room, her bag full of tissues and mints and backup scarves. But it was Sam who Claire looked for as she stepped out of the sliding glass doors. The moment he saw her, he stood. She walked toward the car slowly, her hand already reaching for the door before Melissa could open it. Sam leaned out, ears perked, eyes scanning hers. "It's real," she whispered, settling into the seat beside him. "You were right." He rested his head on her lap. Her hand found the soft spot behind his ears. "And we're going to fight it." That night, Claire didn't sleep, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't because of fear. It was because her mind was busy making space for everything, for treatment, for recovery, for the strange, inexplicable gift of having someone, a dog, a shadow of her husband, sense something inside her before any doctor ever could. The next morning, she pulled out one of Daniel's old military notebooks, the pages still smelling faintly of cedar and cologne. She flipped past his writing about field trauma, training exercises, behavioral assessments for Sam, and then she found it. "Samson picks up changes in breathing before I do. Sometimes heart rate too. Eyes dilate when he senses something's off. Can't explain it. Don't need to." She stared at the words for a long time, then added her own below in trembling script. "He knew about me too." Radiation began the following week. Early morning appointments, the scent of antiseptic and metal, the way the techs tried to smile, but never held eye contact too long. Claire moved through it all with a quiet grace, her body heavy but her spirit lighter than it should have been. Every day Sam waited. He couldn't come inside, so Melissa or one of the nurses would keep him just beyond the glass doors. Every time Claire stepped out, he was there. Always. She started to talk to him about it on the ride home. Not just the procedure, but the fear, the fatigue, the way her body didn't feel like hers anymore. He'd lay his head against her side, and just listen. He was always listening. One evening back at home, Claire stood in front of the mirror and pulled off her scarf. Her hair had begun to fall out in tufts. She held one between her fingers and stared at it for a long time. Sam sat behind her, watching. "I'm scared," she said softly. "I thought I'd feel stronger than this." She turned to look at him. "But you already know that, don't you?" He walked over and leaned against her, solid and steady. "Maybe I don't have to be strong every second." Sam didn't move. She smiled, blinking away tears. "You're not letting me go through this alone. I get it now. You didn't stay because you didn't have anywhere else to go. You stayed because you knew I'd need you." She paused, then laughed through her tears. "You stayed because Daniel asked you to." She didn't know if she believed that, but it felt true. She pulled the scarf tighter, turned off the light, and followed Sam to bed. Radiation wore her down quickly. The mornings got harder. Her legs ached. Her appetite disappeared. Her skin was sensitive. Her thoughts clouded. But still every day she rose. Because Sam was waiting, and every night he curled against her in that familiar spot, his nose tucked beneath her arm, like he was still trying to guard the place the tumor used to live. She began calling him my boy without realizing it. My sweet boy, my shadow, Danny's boy, but mine too. He responded to all of it. One night, lying on the couch with a heating pad against her ribs and Sam nestled at her feet, she told him about Daniel's last day, how they didn't know it would be his last, how she brought him his coffee and kissed the top of his head before going outside to feed the birds, how she returned 5 minutes later and found him slumped in his chair, Samson already sitting beside him, quiet and alert, head resting against Daniel's chest like he was trying to will his heart back to life. Sam licked her hand once, gently. "I think you blamed yourself," she whispered. "But it wasn't your fault." He looked up at her, his eyes deep and unreadable. "You stayed with him until the very last second. And now you're doing it for me too." She leaned down and kissed his head. "I'm not going to make the same mistake I made with Daniel. I'm listening now." Treatment lasted 5 weeks. 5 weeks of fatigue, of nausea, of long car rides and short doctor visits. 5 weeks of curling on the couch with Sam pressed against her back like a warm blanket. 5 weeks of Melissa's warm casseroles and gentle reassurances. At the final appointment, the doctor smiled. "We've done everything we can. Now we wait, monitor, follow up. But based on your scans, we're hopeful." Claire nodded. "Hope's good." Sam was waiting outside as always. But when she stepped through the doors, something was different. He wagged his tail. Not faintly, not softly, but joyfully. She laughed through a throat full of tears. "You knew again, didn't you?" He barked once and trotted beside her, head high. That night Claire didn't cry. She opened every window in the house, let the spring air roll in, played Daniel's favorite jazz record, and danced barefoot in the living room, while Sam watched, head cocked. "You don't know it yet," she said, grinning, "but we're not done. Not by a long shot." She had plans, small ones, big ones. She wasn't just going to recover, she was going to live. And Sam was going to be by her side for all of it. Dear listener, if you've ever come through something you weren't sure you could survive, if you've ever had someone, human or animal, walk beside you through fire, please like this video. These stories matter. You matter. Leave a comment if you've ever been saved by love in its quietest form. And subscribe to keep walking with us. Because the love between Claire and Sam isn't just about survival, it's about transformation. And what comes next will show you how loss can become legacy. The first thing Claire noticed was how much lighter the mornings felt. Not physically. Her body was still adjusting to the exhaustion radiation left behind. But in the way the light entered her home, it no longer felt like a spotlight on what was missing. Instead, it felt like an invitation to begin again. She was in remission. The word still felt foreign, delicate, as though saying it out loud might break it, but the scans confirmed it. The doctor's smile had been wide, his voice finally without caution. "We caught it early. You beat it." She didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady, like someone who had been standing on thin ice for months and now, finally, had both feet on solid ground. Sam had been the first to know. Of course he had. That morning, as Claire sat quietly by the window, cup of tea in hand, still stunned by the doctor's call, Sam had climbed into her lap, something he hadn't done since she first brought him home, and pressed his head against her chest. Not in warning, not in worry, but in rest. Like a weight lifted. Like he could finally breathe. "You did it," she whispered. "You brought me back." And she meant it. He wasn't just a dog. He was Daniel's final act of love. A living memory with a heartbeat. A steady presence who refused to let her disappear into grief or fear. When the world had gone dark, Sam had been the match. Over and over again. She started calling him Sam without thinking now. It felt right. Samson belonged to the past. To the uniformed man who trained him, trusted him, loved him. Sam was who he'd become. A healer, a friend, hers. She printed a photo one afternoon, a candid Melissa had taken during one of Claire's hardest weeks of treatment. Claire sat in her recliner, scarf askew, face pale, but eyes bright with laughter. And there was Sam, curled at her feet, head lifted, watching her like always. She framed it. Set it next to a photo of Daniel on the mantel. Then she took a third frame from a drawer, one she'd ordered but hadn't dared to hang. Inside was a charcoal paw print, inked and clean. She stood back and looked at all three. Daniel, Sam, her. Not past and present. Family. That night, she found herself sitting with Melissa on the back porch, legs covered in a thick quilt, tea steaming between them. The sun was setting slow, casting the yard in hues of fire and honey. "I can't believe it," Claire said softly. "It's like I just woke up, like someone turned the volume back on in my life." Melissa smiled. "You came back. I didn't do it alone." Claire looked down at Sam, curled beside her chair, eyes closed, chest rising in even rhythm. "I think he saved me just as much as the doctors did." Melissa didn't argue. She never did. She just squeezed her friend's hand and whispered, "You should tell people." Claire blinked. "What?" "Your story. His story. There's someone out there who needs to hear it." Claire hesitated. "I'm not inspirational. I'm just someone who listened to her dog." Melissa laughed gently. "Exactly." That idea stayed with Claire for weeks. At first it was just a thought she carried around in her chest, like a small stone in her pocket, but it grew heavier each day. She started writing things down, at night, in the early mornings, in the minutes between laundry and errands, pieces of her story, memories, feelings, moments she hadn't dared to speak aloud, now pouring onto paper like they'd been waiting all along. And through it all, Sam sat beside her. He was older now, grayer at the muzzle, a little slower to rise, but his eyes were the same, full of quiet knowing, full of Daniel. Claire began referring to him as Daniel's last gift whenever she spoke about him. Even at her cancer support group. At first, she only shared tiny pieces. "My dog noticed something was wrong before I did." But soon she found herself telling the whole story, about the pacing, the stares, the bark that interrupted her grief, the night he laid across her chest and wouldn't move. There were tears in the room by the time she finished, and afterward, one woman came up, pressing a hand to Claire's shoulder. "My cat did something similar. Before my diagnosis, I didn't listen. I wish I had." Claire hugged her. "You're listening now." In the months that followed, Claire began to feel like someone else. Not someone new, but someone recovered. Someone stronger, not in spite of what she'd been through, but because of it. And Sam was with her for all of it. When she baked again for the first time and forgot to set a timer, it was Sam's bark that reminded her. When she dug out her old gardening gloves and pruned her rose bushes, he sat by the fence, eyes scanning for squirrels, tail wagging lazily. When she danced barefoot to music in the kitchen, he trotted behind her, a little unsteady, still graceful. And when she woke up one morning and looked at the calendar, marked exactly 1 year since her diagnosis, she knew what she had to do. She called the local veterans center. "My husband used to work with a service dog program," she explained. "He trained Sam, our black lab. I want to be involved, in his name." The woman on the phone paused. "Are you asking to volunteer?" "I want to help train." A soft laugh. You've trained a service dog before. No, Claire said. But one trained me. And so it began. Each week, Claire visited the center. She met with handlers, trainers, veterans who were adjusting to new normals. Some who had returned from war with injuries you could see. Some with wounds buried far deeper. And Sam, he came to every session, not as a trainee, but as proof. Proof that a dog could save a life. Proof that healing doesn't always come from medication or machines, but sometimes from a persistent stare and a bark at the right time. At first, the trainers were hesitant. Sam was older now, slower, but once they saw how the other veterans responded to him, how his calm energy filled a room, how he seemed to know who needed him most, they welcomed him like an old friend. One afternoon, Claire sat in the training ring, watching a young woman practice commands with a golden retriever. Sam lay beside her, chin on her boot. The trainer walked over. You've done something special here, Claire. She smiled down at him. He did it. The trainer paused. I mean with yourself. Claire looked away, blinking hard. I didn't think I'd come back, she whispered. After Daniel died, and the diagnosis, I didn't think there was anything left of me to fight for. Sam stirred, tail thumping once. But he knew, she said. He knew I wasn't done yet. That evening, after class, Claire sat in the yard with Sam beneath the stars. A warm breeze moved through the trees. Crickets sang low. The moon hung like a guardian in the sky. She rested her hand on Sam's back. You saved me. He didn't lift his head. You saved both of us, didn't you? He let out a long breath, a soft, contented sigh. And Claire, for the first time in years, felt whole, not healed, whole. Dear listener, if this part of Claire and Sam's journey touched your heart, if you believe, like we do, that love doesn't end with goodbye, but carries on through presence, purpose, and pause, please like this video. It helps more people find stories that matter. Leave a comment below if a pet ever pulled you through something dark. And don't forget to subscribe, because Claire and Sam still have one final step to take. What happens next will bring their story full circle, and show how one man's love didn't end when he passed. It just found a new way to live on. Claire once thought she'd never speak Daniel's name aloud without her voice cracking. But something strange had happened over the past year. Something gentle and slow. It was like grief had peeled itself back layer by layer, not vanishing but softening at the edges. And now when she said his name, at the support group, at the Veterans Center, to Sam when they were alone, there was sorrow. Yes, but there was something else too. Gratitude. She didn't just mourn the man she lost anymore. She celebrated the love they had built, the life they had shared, and above all the gift he had left behind. Sam, that gift had once felt like a burden, a reminder of all the things she didn't understand, didn't want, didn't think she could carry. But now, as she sat on her front porch with Sam curled at her feet and a warm breeze brushing across her cheeks, she realized the truth. He had never been a burden. He had been the bridge between death and healing, between silence and song, between the version of herself she used to be and the woman she was becoming. Her cancer was in remission. Her strength was returning. But most importantly, her heart had opened again. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the air feels like promise. Claire had just returned from the support group. She attended weekly now, not as a patient drowning in diagnosis, but as a woman with something to give. Every time she spoke, she watched others lean in, not just to her words but to the truth of them. And she always told the same story. His name is Sam, she would say. He used to be Daniel's dog. I never thought I could love him. I didn't want to. He wasn't mine. Then she'd pause, glance at the others in the circle, some bawled, some shaking, some silently weeping, and finish with, but then he saved my life. There were always tears after that, but not just sadness, recognition, that yes, animals could be more than comfort. They could be intuition, protection, memory, love that walks and breathes and waits at your side even when you're too broken to speak. After one session, a young woman named Priya came up to her. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her voice small. My dog did the same. He kept jumping on me. I thought he was acting out. But I went to the doctor just to prove a point. and they found a mass. Claire reached for her hand. You listened, she said. That's what matters. No, Priya whispered. He listened. Claire smiled. That's how they love us. Later that week, Claire walked into the local library. For the first time in years. She used to spend hours there, long before Daniel's passing, back when the quiet felt like peace and not punishment. This time she brought something with her. A manila envelope. Inside, her story. 10 pages, single-spaced, typed carefully over months, rewritten a dozen times until it felt right. The title, He Was My Husband's Dog. I never expected him to save me. She handed it to the librarian. I heard you're collecting local memoirs, she said. The woman behind the desk smiled kindly. We are, for our community collection. Claire hesitated. It's not just about me, it's about a dog, about grief, and about what happens when you stop pushing love away. The librarian took the envelope. Sounds like a story we all need. That night Claire sat on the porch again, the stars freckling the sky. She sipped tea. Sam lay beside her, older now, a little stiffer in the joints, slower to rise, but still watchful, still constant. You know, she said, looking out into the dark. I used to resent you. He blinked slowly. You were a reminder of what I lost, of the man who trained you, who loved you, who was supposed to grow old with me. She looked down at him, her voice softer now. But I see it different now. You weren't a shadow of Daniel. You were his echo, his way of telling me not to give up. Sam leaned his head against her ankle. I know I wasn't easy to love at first, she whispered. I know I pushed you away. But you stayed. She swallowed hard, the warmth of tears rising. You stayed even when I didn't want you, even when I tried to send you away, even when I screamed. A breeze lifted her scarf slightly. You're not just his dog anymore, Sam. You're my heart. Inside on the fireplace mantel sat 3 things. A photo of Daniel, in uniform, smiling with his arm draped around Claire on their front porch. A framed print of Sam's paw, pressed carefully in gray ink. And in the center, a new photo. Claire and Sam, cheek to muzzle, taken the day after her final treatment. She was bald and beautiful, eyes closed, smiling into his fur like she'd never known joy until that moment. Melissa had taken the picture. You need to frame this, she said. It's not just a photo, it's a resurrection. Claire hadn't argued, because she felt it too. It was the photo of a woman who had crawled through fire and come out wrapped in fur and forgiveness. A few weeks later, Claire received an invitation from the Veterans Center, a fundraiser. They wanted her to speak about Daniel, about Sam, about healing. She almost said no, but Sam walked into the kitchen while she was reading the letter, sat beside her, and gently rested his head on her lap. All right, she whispered. We'll do it, for him. The night of the fundraiser, she stood behind a wooden podium. Sam curled at her feet. The room was full. Families, veterans, handlers, donors. The air was thick with emotion, expectation. Claire cleared her throat, voice trembling. My husband Daniel was a soldier, she began. Strong, proud, stubborn. He didn't talk much about what he saw, but he always said the same thing about Sam. He doesn't talk either, but he listens. Soft laughter rippled through the room. When Daniel died, I didn't want the dog. I didn't want anything. I wanted to disappear. She paused, eyes scanning the room. But Sam wouldn't let me. He paced when I couldn't sleep. He barked when I sat still too long. He jumped on me when something felt off, and he pressed his head against my chest again and again, until I finally went to the doctor. She took a breath. They found an aggressive tumor, but it hadn't spread yet, because Sam had already found it. Gasps moved through the room. I'm standing here today, Claire said, because of a dog I didn't want, a dog who refused to leave, a dog who gave me a second chance. She looked down at him. He was Daniel's dog, but now he's mine, and I thank God for that every single day. The standing ovation didn't surprise her. What surprised her was how calm she felt in the silence that followed, how whole, how ready to keep sharing their story, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real. The fundraiser raised more than expected. Sam was given an honorary medal. Claire tucked it into his memory box beside Daniel's flag. And that night, back on the porch, she whispered into the dark, "You'd be proud of him, Danny. Of both of us." Sam let out a sigh. It sounded like peace. Dear listener, if you've ever had something you thought was a burden turn out to be your greatest blessing, please like this video. Let this be a reminder. Love doesn't always come in the package you expect, but when it stays, when it saves, it becomes something sacred. Share your story in the comments if a pet changed your life, and subscribe, because the final chapter of Claire and Sam's story is coming next, and it's the one where everything comes full circle. The summer morning felt different. Lighter, warmer, filled with that rare kind of stillness that doesn't come from silence but from peace. The world hadn't changed, not really. Birds still chirped, a breeze still rustled the leaves, but Claire felt it in her bones. Something had come full circle. She stood in the living room, her hand resting lightly on the back of Daniel's favorite chair, the chair that once sat untouched for months after his death, too sacred to move, too painful to claim. She'd tried rehoming Sam back then, tried rehoming the memory, but now that chair had a soft dog bed on it, a little worn around the edges, flecked with fur and shaped perfectly to cradle a black Labrador named Sam. He lay curled in it now, eyes half-lidded, nose twitching in a dream. Claire smiled. Today was the 1-year anniversary of her remission. 1 year since Sam had warned her. 1 year since the biopsy, the surgery, the radiation. 1 year since her life, once wrapped in grief, had been unwrapped by something with pause and patience. She walked over and gently rubbed Sam's back. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" He didn't wake, but his tail gave one soft thump. There had been a time she couldn't even look at him without seeing Daniel's shadow. Now she couldn't imagine her life without him. Not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as a presence that rooted her, filled her, kept her grounded when the world tried to knock her down. They'd saved each other. That thought had followed her all year, like a mantra. On the bad days, it held her up. On the good days, it made her cry. And today, on this day that marked her return to the living, Claire was ready to do something she'd never done before. She picked up the phone and called the Veterans Therapy Dog Center. "Hi, it's Claire. I think I'm ready to help train." They already knew her. She'd been volunteering for months, speaking, showing up, offering her story. But today was different. Today she wanted to do more. "I want to be part of it, the full process, from the beginning." There was a pause on the other end. "Then we'd be honored." That afternoon, Claire and Sam arrived at the training facility. Sam walked slower now, but with purpose. He no longer wore his old vest. He was retired. But when he entered the room, the other handlers stood up, not out of formality, but out of respect. He was a legend now. The dog who had warned his handler about seizures, and later saved his widow from cancer. Claire smiled at the younger trainees gathered around. "I was where you are once," she began. "Scared, lost, just trying to get through the day. But I had a husband who believed in dogs like this. And I had a dog who believed in me, when I didn't believe in myself." She paused and looked at Sam, who was now lying by her feet, eyes closed, but ears still tuned to her voice. "This dog is why I'm standing here. He stayed when I pushed him away. He barked when I needed silence broken. He pressed his head into my chest until I finally went to the doctor, and because of him, I got a second chance." They were quiet, every one of them. Claire took a breath. "I used to think my life ended when I lost my husband, and then when I got sick, I thought it ended again. But life doesn't end when things break. It begins when we choose to put the pieces back together." Afterward, one of the new veterans approached her. He was young, early 30s, nervous. "Do you really think a dog could help someone like me?" he asked. Claire smiled and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I think a dog could help anyone, especially someone like you." He glanced down at Sam. "Do they really know?" "They do," she said. "Not with words, but with something deeper." That evening Claire and Sam returned home. The sun was beginning to set, casting the world in that soft amber light that makes everything feel touched by memory. She sat on the porch steps, Sam beside her. "Do you remember the first time you barked at me?" she asked, grinning. He huffed through his nose, resting his head on her lap. "I thought you were broken," she whispered. "But it turns out, I was." She stroked his fur slower now. There were more white hairs around his muzzle. His gait was different. He tired more easily. But he was still here, still hers. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something she'd carried all day. A small round, silver medallion, with a paw print etched in the center, and a simple engraving around the edge. "You saved me, and I'll carry you always." It wasn't for Sam to wear. It was for her. She wore it now, close to her heart. As the stars came out, Claire thought about everything they'd been through. Daniel, the diagnosis, the pain, the fear, and then the slow, steady healing that followed. All because of a dog she never meant to keep. All because of love that refused to give up. Eventually, Sam stood, stretched, and walked to the edge of the yard, his eyes scanning the trees like he used to when Daniel was alive. And then he came back. He lay beside her again, head on her knee, like always. "I think he sent you," she whispered. Sam didn't move. She smiled. "That's what I'm going to believe, until the end." And in that quiet moment, with the wind rustling the leaves and the night wrapping gently around them, Claire knew something for certain. Grief never really leaves, but neither does love. And if you're lucky, sometimes love finds its way back in the most unexpected form. Like a black Labrador named Sam. Dear listener, if this story touched your heart, if you believe in the quiet, powerful ways animals save us, please like this video. Let Claire and Sam's journey remind you that healing can start in the smallest of ways, with a stare, a bark, a paw. Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear about the pet who saved you, and don't forget to subscribe, because here, we celebrate stories of hope, healing, and the incredible bond between people and the animals who never give up on them.